The martini-drinking operative who saves the world before dinner doesn't exist. The midnight car chase through foreign capitals, the split-second defusal of nuclear threats, the glamorous seduction in five-star hotels, these are the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about espionage. The truth is far more unsettling. Real intelligence work happens in fluorescent-lit cubicles where analysts spend years tracking financial transactions. It unfolds in parking lots where case officers wait for hours for a contact who may never show. It lives in the minds of people who cannot tell their families what they do, who carry secrets that slowly separate them from everyone they love. The danger of espionage is not that it's too exciting. The danger is that it's not exciting enough. And this gap between myth and reality has consequences that extend far beyond the intelligence community itself. Popular culture has constructed an elaborate fantasy about intelligence work, and we have accepted it without question. We imagine operatives who possess unlimited resources, who move through the world with absolute confidence, who face moral dilemmas and resolve them within a 2-hour time frame. We picture technology that doesn't exist, authority that operates without oversight, and outcomes that arrive cleanly, without collateral damage or lasting consequences. This mythology serves a purpose. It transforms the uncomfortable reality of state surveillance, manipulation, and covert action into something we can admire, something that looks like heroism rather than what it actually is. The mythology makes us feel safer, as if the people protecting us possess capabilities beyond ordinary human limitation. But every myth we accept about espionage takes us further from understanding how intelligence actually functions, and this ignorance has a cost. The reality begins with time. Real intelligence operations don't unfold in frantic 48-hour windows. They develop across months and years through patient cultivation of sources, through the gradual assembly of information that arrives in fragments, often incomplete, frequently contradictory. An intelligence officer might spend 18 months building a relationship with a potential asset, meeting in unremarkable locations, discussing seemingly trivial matters, slowly establishing trust through consistency rather than charm. The work requires a tolerance for tedium that popular narratives never acknowledge. Hours spent reviewing surveillance footage where nothing happens. Days analyzing communication patterns that reveal no clear meaning. Weeks waiting for authorization to proceed with an operation that may be canceled for reasons the officer will never fully understand. The psychological demand is not adrenaline management, but patience management, the ability to maintain focus and discipline when nothing confirms that your work matters, when success looks identical to failure for extended periods. The mythology of advanced gadgetry particularly distorts public understanding of intelligence methods. While technology plays a role in modern espionage, the fundamental tools remain what they have always been: human psychology, observation, and the exploitation of trust. An operative's most valuable asset is not a concealed weapon or an encrypted communication device, but rather the ability to read people, to identify vulnerability, to understand what someone wants badly enough that they'll compromise their principles to obtain it. Real tradecraft involves learning how to become unremarkable, how to exist in spaces without drawing attention, how to hold conversations that extract information without the other person realizing they've revealed anything significant. It requires studying the small details that indicate stress, deception, or opportunity. The work is closer to clinical psychology than to action heroics, and it demands a kind of sustained attention to human behavior that most people would find exhausting. The bureaucratic reality of intelligence work remains perhaps the most carefully hidden truth. Every operation exists within layers of authorization, oversight, and documentation. Officers write extensive reports that are reviewed by committees, revised according to policy guidelines, and sometimes rejected entirely for reasons that have nothing to do with operational merit. Political considerations shape which intelligence gets prioritized, how it gets interpreted, and what actions are permitted in response. The romantic notion of the rogue operative who ignores orders to do what is right has no place in actual intelligence services. where deviation from protocol can end careers and create diplomatic incidents. The operational environment is one of constraint and compromise, where officers must navigate competing priorities from multiple government agencies, where the legally permissible course of action is often not the most effective one, and where success is measured not by dramatic outcomes but by incremental progress that may never become publicly visible. The psychological cost of intelligence work operates on frequencies that popular narratives rarely acknowledge. The isolation is not dramatic or temporary. It's structural and permanent. Officers cannot discuss their work with partners, cannot explain their absences, cannot share the experiences that shape them most profoundly. They develop relationships with assets knowing those relationships are transactional, built on manipulation, and will likely end in betrayal of some kind. They make moral compromises that seem reasonable within operational context, but that accumulate over time into a kind of ethical erosion that becomes difficult to recognize until it has already transformed them. The psychological pressure comes not from immediate danger, but from sustained duplicity, from the cognitive load of maintaining multiple identities, from the awareness that mistakes don't just mean personal failure, but potentially catastrophic consequences for others. The services provide psychological support, but the fundamental problem remains. The work requires you to become someone your former self wouldn't recognize, and there's no clear path back. The outcomes of intelligence work bear no resemblance to cinematic resolution. Most operations don't succeed or fail cleanly. They produce ambiguous results that generate further questions. Intelligence that seems actionable proves unreliable. Operations that appear successful create unexpected consequences. The asset you've spent years cultivating provides information that turns out to be disinformation from a hostile service. The threat you've been tracking disappears not because it was neutralized, but because it shifted to methods your collection systems can't detect. Success in intelligence work often means preventing something that never happens, which means never knowing with certainty whether your work mattered or whether the threat was never as serious as assessed. This fundamental ambiguity creates a professional environment where validation is rare, where you must maintain commitment without confirmation, and where the psychological rewards that sustain most careers are largely absent. The mythology we've constructed around espionage is not harmless entertainment. It shapes public expectations about what intelligence services can and should accomplish. It influences how we think about privacy, surveillance, and state power. It creates pressure on intelligence professionals to match fictional standards that have no relationship to operational reality. Perhaps most importantly, it prevents serious public discourse about intelligence work because we're discussing fantasy versions rather than actual practices, actual constraints, actual ethical compromises. The comfortable myths we prefer protect us from confronting what we've authorized our governments to do in our name. And this willful ignorance serves neither security nor democracy. The real danger of espionage may not be the dramatic scenarios we imagine, but rather the quiet, persistent reality. We've chosen not to examine a reality where power operates without glamour, where moral compromise happens gradually rather than heroically, and where the people doing the work are isolated by secrets we've decided we don't want to understand. That quiet reality begins each morning in ways that would disappoint anyone seeking validation for their cinematic expectations. Intelligence officers arrive at secure facilities that resemble corporate offices more than covert operations centers. They pass through security checkpoints, authenticate their credentials through multiple verification systems, and settle into workstations where they'll spend most of their operational day. The work that follows is meticulous and repetitive, reviewing overnight cable traffic from foreign stations, analyzing signals intelligence reports that may contain fragments of relevant communication, buried among thousands of irrelevant transmissions, cross-referencing financial data to identify patterns that might indicate illicit activity, writing assessment reports that require precise language, careful attribution of sources, and adherence to classification protocols. This is the actual texture of intelligence work, and it demands a temperament suited to detail orientation and sustained concentration rather than improvisation and risk-taking. The recruitment of assets, portrayed in popular narratives as seductive encounters or dramatic ideological conversions, unfolds across timelines that test the limits of operational patience. A case officer might identify a potential recruitment target and spend 6 months simply establishing a plausible reason to be in the same professional or social spaces. The initial approach, when it finally comes, is indirect and deniable. A conversation about shared interests, an offer of assistance with some mundane problem, the gradual construction of rapport through reliability and consistency. Only after months of contact does the relationship begin to shift toward anything operational. And even then, the progression is careful and incremental. The potential asset must be assessed continuously for reliability, for counterintelligence risk, for psychological stability. They must be guided toward providing information in ways that don't trigger their own security awareness or create patterns that hostile services might detect. The entire process requires managing another person's fear, ambivalence, and self-interest while maintaining the operational discipline to walk away. If the risk calculation shifts unfavorably, there are no passionate speeches about freedom or destiny. There are only quiet conversations where one person slowly convinces another to betray their country, their colleagues, or their principles, usually for reasons far more prosaic than ideology. The surveillance operations that occupy substantial portions of intelligence work bear no resemblance to high-speed pursuits or clever disguises. Real surveillance is static, prolonged, and mentally corrosive. Officers sit in vehicles for 8-hour shifts watching an entrance where the target may or may not appear. They monitor communication feeds where relevant information arrives unpredictably among hours of irrelevant content. They maintain observation posts in apartments or office buildings, documenting the movements and contacts of subjects who mostly follow routine patterns that reveal nothing operationally significant. The challenge is not physical danger, but attention degradation. Maintaining focus during the long periods when nothing happens. Recognizing the significant detail when it finally appears among the noise of ordinary activity. Managing the physiological effects of irregular schedules, poor nutrition, and the stress of sustained alertness. Surveillance teams rotate personnel to prevent fatigue errors, but the fundamental problem remains that human attention cannot maintain peak performance during extended periods of low-stimulus activity. The failures in surveillance operations typically result not from dramatic confrontations, but from momentary lapses in concentration after hours of monotonous observation. The decision-making structure within intelligence services directly contradicts the mythology of the autonomous operative making split-second choices. Every significant operational decision moves through approval chains that involve legal review, policy assessment, risk analysis, and coordination with other agencies. A case officer who wants to task an asset with collecting specific information must submit a formal request that details the intelligence requirement, the operational approach, and the risk mitigation measures. This request is reviewed by station leadership, forwarded to headquarters elements, sometimes coordinated with liaison services, and either approved, modified, or rejected. The process can take days or weeks. Time-sensitive operations receive expedited handling, but even then, the officer cannot simply act on instinct or personal judgment. The bureaucratic structure exists precisely to prevent individual decision-making, to ensure that operations align with policy priorities and legal constraints, and to distribute accountability across institutional layers. This reduces operational flexibility, but it also reduces catastrophic errors, unauthorized actions, and the personal psychological burden of individual officers, bearing sole responsibility for decisions with potentially serious consequences. The human cost of this work accumulates in ways that never appear in dramatized versions of espionage. Officers learn to suppress normal emotional responses, Because operational effectiveness requires them to manipulate people without being compromised by empathy or guilt. They develop what psychologists call compartmentalization, the ability to separate their operational identity from their personal identity. But this separation is never complete and never without cost. Relationships outside work become difficult to maintain because the officer cannot share the experiences that increasingly define them. They cannot explain why they seem emotionally distant or why certain topics make them uncomfortable. They cannot process traumatic or morally complex operational experiences with the people who care about them. The intelligence services provide internal psychological support, but seeking that support often carries career implications, creates questions about operational reliability, and still doesn't resolve the fundamental isolation built into the work itself. Officers watch colleagues leave the profession not because of physical danger, but because of accumulated psychological erosion, the slow dissolution of the person they were before the work changed them into someone their former self wouldn't recognize or necessarily respect. The actual dangers that intelligence officers face are rarely cinematic. The primary threat is not assassination, but compromise. The risk is that hostile counterintelligence services will identify you, map your network of contacts, and either neutralize your operations or, worse, turn them against you without your knowledge. The danger is that you'll make a mistake in tradecraft, a small error in timing or communication security. That exposes an asset to arrest and imprisonment. The threat is that you'll miss a warning sign that someone you're rerunning is actually controlled by another service, feeding you information designed to mislead your government's policy decisions. These failures don't announce themselves dramatically. They often aren't discovered until months or years later, when classified information appears in places it shouldn't, or when geopolitical events unfold in ways your intelligence said they wouldn't. The psychological weight of these failures is crushing precisely because they result not from obvious mistakes, but from imperceptible errors in judgment, from moments of fatigue or distraction, from human limitations confronting operational demands that exceed human capacity. The reality that emerges from this examination is more demanding than any mythology precisely, because it offers none of the psychological rewards that fictional narratives provide. There are no clear victories, no moments of vindication, no external validation that your sacrifices served a purpose worthy of what they cost you. Intelligence work requires you to accept that you may never know whether your contributions mattered, that the most important intelligence you produce might prevent a crisis that therefore never happened, and thus never confirms your value. It demands that you live with moral ambiguity, that you operate in ethical spaces where the available choices are all compromised in different ways, and that you make peace with using methods that conflict with the values you believe you're defending. The operational reality is not more dangerous because it involves more action or more immediate threats. It's more dangerous because it requires you to sustain commitment, discipline, and psychological stability in an environment designed to erode all three, and to do this while isolated from the normal human support systems that make such endurance possible. The quiet reality of espionage extracts costs that action sequences never capture. And these costs are paid not in dramatic moments, but across years of accumulated strain that transform people in ways they cannot fully articulate even to themselves. The consequences of intelligence work extend far beyond the operational timeline, into futures that bear no resemblance to cinematic conclusions. Officers leave the profession carrying secrets they can never disclose, experiences they can never process publicly, and psychological adaptations that don't translate back into civilian life. They have spent years learning to read people for vulnerability, to construct false identities, to suppress emotional responses. And these capabilities don't simply deactivate when the operational role ends. Former intelligence officers describe a permanent sense of distance from normal social interaction, an inability to engage with people without analyzing their motivations and assessing their truthfulness. They carry knowledge about what their government has done, what allies have requested, what moral lines have been crossed in service of security objectives. and this knowledge cannot be shared or forgotten. Some transition successfully, finding ways to integrate their experiences into new professional identities. Others struggle with depression, substance abuse, relationship failures, and the profound isolation of being unable to explain to anyone who they actually became. During their operational years, the intelligence services track these outcomes imperfectly, provide limited support, and generally prefer that former officers fade quietly into ordinary life, rather than becoming visible reminders of the human cost of national security operations. The operations themselves often end without resolution or recognition. Missions are suspended when geopolitical priorities shift, when budget allocations change, when policymakers decide the risk no longer justifies the potential intelligence gain. Officers who have invested years building networks, cultivating sources, and developing operational capacity watch their work dismantled for reasons that have nothing to do with its effectiveness. Assets who have risked everything are sometimes abandoned when maintaining contact becomes diplomatically inconvenient or operationally complicated. These terminations happen through bureaucratic process, documented in classified files that will likely never be declassified, affecting lives that will never receive acknowledgement or compensation for what was asked of them. The mythology suggests that intelligence work builds toward climactic moments of revelation or decisive action. The reality is that most operations simply stop, their intelligence product absorbed into analytical databases, their human consequences left unaddressed, and their participants moving to different assignments without closure or confirmation that their work served any purpose beyond institutional process. The measurement of success in intelligence work operates on principles that defy popular understanding. Services consider operations successful when threats are detected early enough that they can be neutralized through diplomatic, economic, or covert means that prevent them from escalating into public crises. This means that the most effective intelligence work produces outcomes where nothing visible happens. Terrorist attacks that don't occur because surveillance detected planning activities. Hostile intelligence operations that fail because counterintelligence services identified and neutralized them before they could compromise sensitive information. Regional conflicts that don't escalate because intelligence assessments provided policymakers with accurate warning time. These successes cannot be publicized without compromising sources and methods, cannot be celebrated without alerting adversaries to capabilities, and cannot provide the operatives involved with any external validation of their contribution. Intelligence professionals must accept that effectiveness often looks identical to an activity, that preventing something requires proving a negative, and that the absence of crisis is the only confirmation they'll receive that their work mattered. The persistent mythology around espionage serves purposes beyond entertainment. It provides publics with a psychologically comfortable narrative about how state power operates in their name. The myth suggests that intelligence work is conducted by exceptional individuals who act from clear moral conviction, who operate within recognizable ethical frameworks, and who achieve outcomes that justify their methods. This mythology allows citizens to avoid confronting what covert action actually involves: the manipulation and exploitation of human vulnerability, the use of methods that would be criminal in domestic contexts, the acceptance of collateral damage in pursuit of strategic advantage, and the exercise of unaccountable power by institutions that operate beyond normal democratic oversight. The myths protect us from recognizing that national security requires capabilities and actions that conflict with stated values, that intelligence services must sometimes do things we would condemn if done by adversaries, and that this moral complexity cannot be resolved through individual heroism or dramatic interventions. We prefer the mythology because the reality is politically and psychologically uncomfortable, because it raises questions about the relationship between democracy and secrecy that have no satisfying answers. The broader implications of this gap between myth and reality extend into how democratic societies understand and oversee intelligence activities. When public discourse is shaped by fictional narratives, Citizens lack the conceptual framework to evaluate actual intelligence practices, or to engage meaningfully with questions about oversight, accountability, and the boundaries of covert action. Legislative bodies struggle to provide effective oversight when their constituents believe intelligence work resembles cinematic narratives rather than bureaucratic process. Intelligence services face pressure to demonstrate effectiveness through visible operations, rather than through the quiet prevention of threats that never materialize into public awareness. This creates incentive structures that can push services toward more aggressive or risky operations that produce tangible results, even when more patient approaches might be strategically superior. The mythology damages both public understanding and operational effectiveness, creating expectations that intelligence work cannot and should not try to meet. The historical record, when it eventually emerges through declassification, consistently reveals that intelligence operations were more morally complex, more prone to failure, and more constrained by bureaucratic and political factors than contemporary accounts suggested. Operations that seemed justified by urgent threat assessments turn out to have been based on incomplete or manipulated intelligence. Covert actions that were presented as necessary responses to aggression are revealed to have been preemptive interventions driven by geopolitical positioning rather than defensive necessity. The human costs, the assets abandoned, the operations that failed catastrophically. The long-term consequences of short-term tactical decisions become visible only decades later. Too late for accountability, but not too late to inform how we evaluate current intelligence activities. This pattern should encourage skepticism about official narratives and popular mythologies alike. But instead, each generation recreates comfortable myths that protect them from confronting uncomfortable realities until those realities become historical problems that someone else must address. Understanding the reality of espionage matters not because it makes us safer, but because it makes us more honest about the tools of state power and the costs they impose. Intelligence work is not inherently noble or corrupt. It's a capability that states develop because international competition and security threats require information advantage, influence operations, and covert action. The work is necessary within the current international system, but necessity doesn't resolve the moral complexity or erase the human cost. Citizens in democratic societies have an obligation to understand what is done in their name, to demand accountability even for secret operations, and to reject comfortable mythologies that prevent serious engagement with these questions. This understanding begins with recognizing that real espionage looks nothing like popular entertainment, that the people conducting intelligence work are neither heroes nor villains, but professionals operating in morally ambiguous spaces, and that the most significant intelligence successes will never be publicly known, while the most serious failures will eventually be revealed, whether institutions wish to acknowledge them or not. If this examination of espionage reality has challenged your understanding of intelligence work, if it's prompted questions about the relationship between security and accountability, then engage with this content. Press the like button to signal that honest analysis of difficult topics matters. Subscribe to this channel to receive more investigations that prioritize accuracy over entertainment, that examine uncomfortable realities rather than reinforcing comforting myths. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most about the reality of espionage, or what questions this raises for you about power, secrecy, and the tools democratic societies employ for national security. These conversations matter precisely because they are difficult, because they require us to think seriously about topics we prefer to leave to dramatic narratives, and because understanding the reality of intelligence work is part of the responsibility that comes with citizenship in societies that conduct covert operations in our name. The most dangerous myth about espionage is not that it's more exciting than reality, or that operatives possess capabilities beyond ordinary human limitation. The most dangerous myth is that we would recognize the truth if we encountered it, that we would distinguish between the necessary and the excessive, between legitimate security operations and the abuse of covert power. The reality is that intelligence work is designed to be invisible, that its most significant activities leave no public trace, and that the gap between what actually happens and what we were told has happened may be unbridgeable by design. The comfortable myths we've constructed don't just distort our understanding of espionage. They protect us from confronting how much we don't know, how much we've agreed not to know, and how much power we've granted to institutions we cannot effectively monitor or control. That invisibility is not a failure of intelligence work. It's the point